Hello, how's it going out there? I just say that I appreciate you bringing this up because the two basic hypotheses as to what near-death experiences are, if you want to look at them broadly, would be either it's a naturalistic, it can be explained purely naturalistically as a part of the dying brain. We'll call it the dying brain hypothesis. Or this is a real experience with something regarding the afterlife. We'll call it the spiritual afterlife hypothesis. And under naturalism, you're assuming that what these really are some type of either vivid dreams or hallucinations, and that they're just really drawing from what our expectations are of the afterlife, from our ideas, from our own brain, and so we can really set up a scientific test and say, let number one, we make an observation. All these 4% of the population are experiencing near-death experiences. We make an observation. We say, "Ooh, is this better explained by a naturalistic explanation or by something spiritual?" And you say, "Hey, here's a test. Let's look at multiple cultures, multiple types of people, under multiple belief systems." Because if it's just being pulled from our brain, we ought to find a wide variety of of content to the experience that should not be unified. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what we're doing, is holding up these hypotheses and seeing what they look like across cultures.
Right, right. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I know I just realized my mic was muted for the intro. But Steve did a good job of talking about what we're going to discuss today. Should be good now. But yeah, we'll be talking about cultural influences for this episode. But Steve was kind of talking about those of how we're looking to identify that pattern and see how that emerges from the varying cultures. All right, let's go ahead and hop into it, Steve. So let's start first and foremost with the explanation component. Got my notes here. First off, we know that 4% of the population experiences these experiences to be repetitive. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason this is important is because within this context, we can safely assume, that even in cultures where near-death experiences are underreported, that it's just exactly that they're underreported, not that they're not that they're not happening in those cultures. So we may have more of them being recorded here within Western culture, but that doesn't mean that they're not happening on average within, maybe at even a greater frequency than 4% across all cultures across the world. It's just that within Western cultures, we have more, I would say, modern sciences and modern ability to track and find those things interesting. I think especially since, and Steve, feel free to comment on this. Like, I think especially since we're a more of a secularized culture, in modern day, that we may be more fascinated by these experiences versus other cultures that have more of a spiritual influence, would be like, kind of find these experiences consistent with their worldview. Would you agree, disagree with that?
I think it just varies from culture to culture. For some, this might be, for a lot of primitive cultures, for example, they just think of these things as being a part of life, and you wouldn't think of studying it on a deep degree, maybe. Whereas, yeah, it's especially fascinating over here because for so many years, naturalism, materialism has been so strong in science, and these seem to speak against that or not be consistent with a pure materialistic worldview. So, yeah, it makes it pretty fascinating for Western science to be studying it.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week, if you guys weren't here last week, we were talking about the natural, the dying brain hypothesis that um, these experiences are just an accumulation of your cultural influences, and then you mix in this kind of chemical cocktail that your brain just shoots into your body when you die, and then that's how these experiences are being produced. If you weren't here for the last week, we essentially debunked that, saying that these studies were only able to mimic at best a small fraction of the actual elements that we would find within near-death experiences. So therefore, they're not at all capable of meeting the level of explanatory power required in order to say, yeah, these are just natural happening experiences. So what seems the more likely hypothesis is that there is in fact a spiritual afterlife, okay, and that these people are genuinely walking into the spiritual afterlife and having an experience in this afterlife. But of course, what do we do with the information they're coming back with, right? Where they'll say, oh yeah, I recognize the buildings from my culture. I recognize the people from my culture. And of course, this has been reported over a grand period of time, right, Steve? So we have near-death experiences going, I think the first one we have on date is it Socrates, who writes in it in his First Republic, where there's a soldier who dies and then comes back talking about a heavenly experience. Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, Plato's Republic,
Plato's
the
Republic,
story of it's toward the end of his very famous Republic, and he tells about this story. So, yeah, way back in many cultures, we found these in the past and then in the present as well. So, I would say that I think we ought to start off with where is the research? The main researchers who've been researching these all their lives, especially since 1975 or so when Moody started this, they all will say consistently that there is a pattern. There's a pattern globally as to what we see in these experiences, and the pattern is people. The pattern is the same whether you're an atheist or a Christian, whether you're in some Eastern religion, whether you're male or female, young or old, in this country or another country. There's a distinct pattern, and maybe we can just both of us together. What are the main elements or core elements that we see over and over again? And again, I don't think this would be expected if it's just randomly pulling expectations from our brain. But let's go over again. What are some of the main core elements? I'd say, okay, these people are coming out of their body.
Yeah,
They're
common leaving the body, heightened senses, positive emotions, stating that it was definitely real, a tunnel experience, seeing a light, meeting deceased relatives, talking to celestial beings, altered time and space, life review, a beautiful heavenly realm, special knowledge, coming to a barrier, returning to the body, changed lives, and the overwhelming priority of love.
Now, this is okay. If you're a Christian listening to this, you see, some people will say, well, okay, well, yeah, globally people experience these because those are all the general things people are expecting when they die. I say, no, not really, not even for Christians. So what do you as a Christian expect to happen, Charlie, when you die, your final death? What are you expecting to happen as a believer?
My expectation would be my soul would separate from my body, and then I would head to the heavenly gates. At which point I would be let in because of my faith in Christ, and then proceed to meet deceased Christians, believers, people God has found worthy, and begin to
And some kind of probably a something about your deeds or whatever, assessment or judgment of deeds or something. But what you're not expecting for your final death is to leave your body, look down and see your body laying there, uh, go through a tunnel of light. Time
Hmm.
and space seem to disappear. You're talking to people mind to mind rather than physically. All these things. You're not really expecting all that. What you're expecting is a final death, and rightfully so, because only 4% of the population has near-death experiences. Everybody has a final death experience at
Hmm.
some point, right? So when I'm
Yeah.
having a cardiac arrest, if I'm thinking about dying, I'm thinking about, oh my goodness, I'm expecting a final death. We're not as Christians expecting a halftime, assessment to come
Sure.
up like a near death experience. So I think it's outside of the Christian expectation. And then outside of so many other expectations, like your typical Muslim, if they're following the hadiths, are probably planning to experience something that's very traumatic emotionally and physically at death. Certain people who believe in reincarnation are believing that that happens pretty soon after death. Well, they're not expecting to go to the other side and see deceased people who have been dead for years. That would be against their expectation. So to me, this whole near death experience, and people will often just say it was so unexpected. An atheist is expecting to see nothingness.
Hmm.
A Jehovah's Witness, one of my students had a Jehovah's Witness relative who he was very staunch, kind of like an elder within his church, and so he was expecting soul sleep at death, and then your your body is going to heavenly places at the end of time, right? But he's expecting soul sleep. But he was dying, and in the process of dying, he gets all excited because he's beginning to see deceased relatives on the other side. Well, that was totally unexpected to him in his theology, and to any person who has a theology either of soul sleep or reincarnation or something else. So consistently, I think under naturalism, you'd expect this to differ greatly. Now maybe I should caution us and say, when we say that there are a core experience and there's a pattern, we don't necessarily mean a carbon copy, even here in America, because the tunnel that so many talk about. Sometimes they'll describe it as very bright, sometimes multicolored, and often they won't even say. They'll say, "I guess it was sort of like a tunnel. It's one of these ineffable things." But other people will say, "Well, it was more like an escalator." What's that? But the agreement is that you're getting the impression that you're going somewhere, like into
Hmm.
another dimension. My theory is that there really may not even be a tunnel. Basically, someone from the other side, I assume God, is giving us the feeling, the impression to let us know we're going to another dimension out here. And so for one person, he may show us one thing, for another, another. It's not, we don't expect it. Just like if you're going to another country, you expect everyone to see the same bridge described the same way. Well, it may be different. The clothes you wear, if if uh, if you're seeing a deceased relative, sometimes they're just kind of like a being of light that you know intuitively that that's your relative. Sometimes it looks just like your relative about the age when they died. Sometimes it's the person in their prime. One time a person was on the other side and they were speaking to a relative and they said, "Wow, I'm just surprised to see you looking so old." And the person said, "Oh, well, okay." And then it changed appearance to the person in his prime. What I'm thinking is you don't really need clothes in heaven. You don't need a winter wardrobe and a summer wardrobe and all this. Basically, you are appearing how you want to the person who's coming to make them comfortable. And
Yeah.
so children may very well see their pets because they don't know any deceased relatives at that point.
Hmm.
They may see pets. So it's not a carbon copy, but the elements hold when you think of them in general categories, which would not be expected under naturalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that it's worth noting that when people are dying, they are actually taking the time to kind of soak in the surrounding. Like you were mentioning, they're noticing heightened senses. Whereas I don't feel like in a dream state that that is actually something that is occurring. You're not necessarily taking into heightened sense or feel like you're in control of yourself, your being at that time. So I think that that is something that stands out to me is when these people are in these experiences, they are discussing things like heightened senses, noticing light. They're remembering it very clearly. I think that's another thing that really stands out, right? Is that they remember these experiences with vivid detail. And yeah, an atheist wouldn't expect to see this. So again, it just kind of debunks this whole naturalistic explanation that it's just kind of your brain just shotgun blasting chemicals and then just information at you, and then you're kind of just experiencing it. The vividness of it, the structure of it, the pattern of it, these all begin to remove the explanatory power of that theory and start to ask the question of, like, why is this pattern seen across these varying ideologies? Why are atheists seeing this pattern? Why are Jehovah's Witnesses seeing this pattern? Why are Muslims seeing this pattern? And of course, I'm sure in the Christian's mind is like, why are any of these people that are quote unquote unbelievers experiencing this pattern at all? Which, we'll have an episode absolutely dedicated to that in the future. But ultimately, I think Steve's trying to point out that there's a level of comfortability that these experiences seem to be trying to give people. And so therefore, what they're seeing, what they're experiencing has a lot to do with what they would perceive as comfortable or make sense for them. Now, that isn't always the case, because again, some people do experience what would be referred to as a distressing NDE or a hellish NDE, and
yes,
that's that's not exactly comfortable. We'll say,
and that may be up to 20% of the near-death experiences, according to scholars in that field. So I'm glad you brought that up, and we need to. It's not just something anomalous out there, but a lot of people experience distressing or hellish NDEs.
Yeah, and again, like we've pointed this out, that a lot of people don't spend the time to actually talk these things out because they're trying to make sense of them, and even more so for a hellish or distressing NDE because of the embarrassing nature of that. I mean, who would want to go tell their friends, like, hey, I went to hell and this is what I saw? Because that again adds to the validity of it. Is if you take that same level of veracity, we mentioned last week that it's the veracity of the experience that adds to its validity. If you take this extremely real heavenly experience that leaves people completely changed for the rest of their life, imagine the opposite spectrum of that, the opposite end of the scale of that. You're experiencing that. Imagine the embarrassment you would feel, the fear, just things that would kind of petrify you and really not motivate you to go talk about it. So again, researchers who have spent time looking into this find that it is very, very difficult to locate it versus locating like a heavenly experience. People love talking about that, right? Because it's like you go to a great party, you want to tell people how awesome it was, versus if you have the worst day of your life, you're not exactly trying to go around and share that with people.
So let's think about that from a naturalistic perspective. Some people would say, well, this is just wish fulfillment. I mean, it's like you're at the most distressing part of your life. You've just had a heart attack. And so your body's going to react by helping you to get over that. You get some endorphins, so you feel something wonderful. Well, 1 out of 5 of them are not experiencing something wonderful.
Right.
How do you explain that? Is not what they're expecting of their own life, and that's not what they were hoping for. And it doesn't seem to be helping them a lot with their heart attack,
Mm-hmm.
So let me mention one other thing. Okay, we're talking about things that don't seem to jibe with naturalism. One aspect of the experience is the return. And I've done a lot of reflection on this. When you're coming back from the near-death experience, typically people will say, we had this discussion either with angelic figures or with Jesus or with God, and they've got this discussion about, should I come back or not? Well, I don't want to come back. This is wonderful over here, typically 4 out of 5, let's say. This is wonderful. I don't want to come back. But then they'll have a discussion, well, maybe for your children's sake, or what you're supposed to do in life isn't finished. And then you come back and then you wake up. Now, think about it. That is rather strange from a naturalistic perspective. That is very different from a vivid dream or a hallucination, because when do you come back in your storyline from a hallucination or a vivid dream? Well, when the alarm goes off or when they put the paddles on and resuscitate you, the storyline should be interrupted midstream, wherever you are. Now, I track my dreams. I would encourage this of people who study near-death experiences. So Thursday night, I had a dream. I was playing football, and I believe it was University of Georgia coach. You can see my University of Georgia shirt here. I went there for a while. One of my brothers graduated from there. Another one from Tech, and we get along fine though. But I was playing football for coach for the Georgia Bulldogs, and we were playing in a like an abandoned warehouse. So there's just random memories apparently that my brain's putting together into a story, and I'm really enjoying it because I couldn't play football in high school because I had bad asthma in the fall and couldn't breathe well enough. Wanted to, and I was having this dream of playing. And I asked the coach, I looked outside and I saw a football field outside, a nice football field. And I said, hey, could we play out there sometime? And you know what he said? I have no idea. I woke up. It just stopped. Boom, midstream. That's the way dreams start. They're not a full story. Now, compare that to something like a Meg Ryan romantic comedy. Okay, you have a starting place, they're falling in love, then you have a tragedy that happens, and they have a breakup, then they have to get back together, and eventually there they are committed to one another at the end. Then you run the credits. It doesn't end mid-sentence somewhere. Why? Because there's a producer, there's a writer who wrote this story, and it ends appropriately. In near-death experiences, I've read hundreds, thousands of near-death and deathbed experiences. I've never heard of anyone reporting coming back from a near-death experience and saying, oh, well, it just ended mid-sentence. I was having this conversation with an angel, mid-sentence, boom. But that's what we would expect if it's a hallucination or vivid dream. Another thing I've never seen is somebody reporting, I went to the other side, we had this discussion, and we all decided that it was time to stay. And then I woke up. I've never heard anyone say that. Why is it accurate according to the story? It's like there's a producer with a capital P that's putting this thing on for us, so we don't wake up until the story has ended and has its conclusion of, it's time to come back.
So it's that narrative form of having a structured beginning and a structured ending that adds the validity to it, is what you're saying.
Yeah. I used to I have a friend who was a senior psychologist with the Department of Defense, Peter Schaefer. And so he named this the Meg Ryan effect. If y'all want to talk about it in the future, just bring that up. And it's like a Meg Ryan romantic comedy. It plays out as a total story,
right,
which would be unexpected to me under naturalism.
Right. And then obviously if the story has a writer, then you would expect it to have that structure. So, and that would then leave things like theism on the table because it would have a personal deity that could control and craft these experiences.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
The Meg Ryan effect. I think I've read that somewhere, but it's the first time hearing it used in an actual conversation.
It's probably named something else too. Who knows?
Okay. So, to kind of summarize up to this point, we've talked about the cultural influences not really explaining these experiences, because although there may be elements of the cultural influences a part of the experience, which we'll move into, how these are actually influencing them and so on and so forth, but there's still this pattern that we see repeated time and time again that transcends the cultural influences themselves. So therefore it can be reliable to say that this pattern kind of debunks the whole idea of, well, cultural influences. Well, it's like, well, even if that cultural influence is there, then you would expect their religious culture, the religion of their culture, or their personal religion, to play a massive influence on the actual pattern and structure. But that doesn't seem to be the case. In addition to, there always seems to be this feeling of departing your body and a feeling of returning to your body that seems to be the beginning and the ending of these experiences. So therefore the experiencer says, yeah, that was real. I can tell you because of the beginning and the ending and the ultimate pattern and structure and the veracity. So all of these elements coming together to say, look, these naturalistic explanations fall short. These cultural influence explanations have some validity to them. But again, like we said last week, the idea that they have similar elements and therefore can explain the experience itself is incredibly, what would we say, giving it more power than it deserves.
Yes, and I would say that globally you see the same type of differences that you see here in the West. For example, let's say that you're a believer in you're a Muslim living here in the United States and you believe in Allah. You call God
Hmm.
Allah. Well, we might just typically say God as Christians. So I'm going to see a being of light. I know that's the ultimate God intuitively, so I call him God. The Muslim you know, calls him Allah. Well, that doesn't mean you're seeing different things necessarily. You're just calling them something different. And you say, oh, well, some people in India will see a messenger and call it a Yamadut. Well, yeah, that's their name in their culture for a messenger that's not God. It's a spiritual creature. We see the
Hmm.
spiritual creature and we say, hey, that's an angel. I just know it's an angel. The person in India says it's a Yamadut.
Yeah.
Well, they're not saying, oh, well, I saw it looking like this, and it's some specialty creature within my religion. It's just a messenger. So you have different names for it. So we see those same differences within Western culture, and then we see them extended in another culture as well. But there are those who say, well, but wait a minute, there are other differences too. Early studies of near-death experiences, they didn't find anybody in India, for example, who was talking about a tunnel. And they would say, obviously, there's something different about the culture that's causing them to not see tunnels. So sometimes there are varieties, and we wonder, ooh, I wonder why they're not experiencing that. I would say in that case, some of these early studies were not very broad, and sometimes they didn't ask specific enough questions.
Sure.
And again, the idea of a tunnel in a Western society where you've built a lot of tunnels, where you're used to that kind of concept, uh, that might be your analogy of what you're experiencing, where it might not be somewhere else. Or in another culture, they may not think it's that important to mention the fact that you went through a tunnel, where we thought it was really cool and mentioned it because we've been to Whitewater or somewhere where you slid through tunnels and you think tunnels are cool, but maybe the other culture doesn't. So what I did in order to find this out, at the time I was writing my first book, uh, Dr. Long's site, NDERF, NDERF, where
Yeah.
they
Near Death
collect
Experience
near-death
Research
experiences,
Foundation.
had
Yeah.
about 3,000 experiences at that time. So I searched it for non-Western experiences and found about 59 or so of them. The majority of these were from India. And I said, okay, what is their experience? And actually, I found a larger percentage of people saying they had been through tunnels than Dr. Long, when he looked at it globally to see how many were going through tunnels, it was actually a larger amount. So I suspect that in a lot of these earlier studies, they either didn't ask the right questions sometimes, or the people just didn't deem them important. But when they began, uh, like on Dr. Long's site, they answer a series of questions. When they're asked specifically, sometimes they'll actually say it. So I really don't see many differences between cultures, unless
Yeah.
it's like what the person's wearing on the other side or something like that, which
Yeah.
obviously ought to be different if you got a producer doing this thing.
Well, and Steve, I want to interject and say that just because absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, right?
Good point.
Just because someone doesn't bring this point up when they're retelling the experience doesn't mean it didn't happen. And like you said, it's like, unless you ask the pointed question of, well, did you experience a distortion in time and space? They may not find, like, yeah, they may have experienced that, but it's not a present part of the memory until you ask them about it, and then they recall back to it and they go, oh yeah, it totally was there. Just to, use the example to kind of play off your dream that you had earlier. It'd be like, I go to a Georgia football game and I'm at the stadium and I'm, taking all this experience in, and then I go back home and I'm retelling it with my friends of like, oh yeah, this and that and this and that and this and that. And someone like yourself who's familiar with the stadium would, maybe there's like a trademark hot dog stand or something. You'd be like, oh, did you go get Jimmy's hot dog? And I go, yeah, I totally did. I walked right by that stand and I got a hot dog. And it's like, well, why didn't you include it in your story? It's like, well, it wasn't a present part of the memory, but once you brought it up, it absolutely was something that was part of the experience. So just because people from these different cultures aren't necessarily mentioning aspects that we would say, well, this is what a near-death experience or should be experiencing, that doesn't mean that they didn't experience it. It just may mean that they weren't asked a proper question to bring it up, or they didn't find it relevant when they were retelling the experience themselves, because like Steve mentioned, maybe cultural influences for them put a higher emphasis or priority on other aspects of the experience versus in a Western culture. We might come back talking about the overwhelming love versus someone from a culture that has a high view of, like, let's say architecture is really focused in on the buildings they saw on the other side of it. And you'd say, well, this person's focused on buildings and their experience, and this person's focused on love. And it's like, well, it has a lot to do with the person and the emphasis that they found important, because, and this is ultimately what it boils down to, right, is your personal interpretations of the data, right, of the experience is a massive influence, right? Because like Steve said, we can all go to one place, but the data that the information that we're storing that we find relevant, how we interpret the data, maybe the big red G on the field for the Georgia Stadium, maybe I think that stands for golf or something like that. People would think that's ridiculous. But if I don't have an explanation of what it is, it's up to me to interpret the data how I see it fit, right? Or maybe I think it's God, right? The G is for God. But ultimately what I'm trying to say here is, we go through we see these experiences, and then the people coming back interpret those experiences through their cultural lenses, because that's the best thing they have to explain these things they saw on the other side. So of course it's like, yeah, the best thing I have to explain it is it looked like a giant red dragon, right? Even though another person might see it and say it looked like a red eagle. Well, it just depends on what they had to describe what they actually saw, and then that's the best interpretation they have to make sense of that. So again, we don't want.
I think it's very important to distinguish what was actually told to you on the other side, what did you actually experience, in your interpretation. Because I hear a lot of people come out of the experience saying, oh, well, what I learned from that is that, hey, nobody should fear death. It's great over there. Don't worry about it at all. Well, I want to ask, okay, did they actually say that on the other side, that nobody needs to worry about death, and that, well, no, but hey, I've been to the other side and it was great. And it's like, well, that was just one experience. What about these 1 out of 5 that are having terrible experiences? What are they saying about death? And so I think a lot of these people learn more as they think more and seek more, and just their initial interpretation when they come out may be askew. Or they'll say, oh, God's not like I was taught he was at all. He's so accepting and loving and wonderful. Okay, well, if you had just met Jesus when he was here on earth, you might have said the same thing. Hey, Jesus was just so wonderful and accepting, but you don't know all about Jesus, and you didn't see him in every circumstance. And so they draw erroneous conclusions, just like we all do in life. We're all fallible. So we have to think through and even certain things like, when you're told to come back by an angel or someone. Some people in India have claimed that, oh, I went over and it was like I was sitting down in front of an accountant who was saying, no, looking at a book, saying, no, it's not your time yet. Well, that's fine. It's still a part of the pattern. You're being sent back, right? But it's being expressed in a culturally relevant way. The question for the naturalist is why is there a pattern at all?
Yeah.
When you would expect it to be so varied and so different depending on what we're expecting.
And plus, why are there distressing versions? If it's really just a process of copium for us while we're dying, why are there distressing experiences that have such a negative influence on people? Again, because if it's just a compilation of our cultural influences mixed in with chemicals that are known to produce quote unquote euphoric experiences, right? Then why are we having people who walk away from these experiences not necessarily having pleasant experiences at all, right? Which I'm sure we'll dedicate an entire episode or to distressing experiences, or we'll just continually just bring them up because they are part of the experience spectrum and important. And it's important that they be mentioned because there's a lot of people who are going through these things, and it adds a lot to the data set of saying, if these are, again, just an experience to make people feel better, why are these terrible experiences occurring, and what kind of comfort are they providing to people? Because everybody who talks about a distressing experience, for example, they leave those conversations extremely embarrassed and hurt, and they don't really have anything positive to say about it at all. So I feel like that really undermines that whole element of it just being, oh, well, it's just your brain trying to give you some relief because of stress. It's like,
well, and but the positive side of it, many will say that was the best experience I ever had in the end because it shook me up. And I had to re-examine my life, rethink of where I was spiritually, and some of them are Christians who have a hellish experience, and they weren't told they were going to hell or anything, but it shook them up and got them out of their spiritual apathy to realize, wow, I need to reset my priorities.
Okay.
So there can be a good outcome.
So Steve, what I want to do now is, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked a lot about this pattern and what this pattern teaches us as it emerges across varying cultures, varying backgrounds. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually read off some experiences from these non-Western cultures. And the reason we want to focus in on this, because obviously we think the evidence tilts toward eventually theism and ultimately Christianity. That's the end that we think it lands in. So it's important to go to cultures that are kind of the opposite of Christianity, i.e. non-Western, secular, atheistic cultures, because those patterns that emerge from their near-death experiences should shed a lot of light onto whether or not these experiences are just personal or if they're transcendent and actually tapping into this supernatural pattern. So I'm going to read, I'll read off a couple of these for you guys. Chen from China. So the background for Chen was, I believed in Marxism. I joined the Chinese Communist Party when I was in university, and I had a great ambition when I was employed. I deeply believed in materialism, and I strongly rejected anything that related to idealism. Neither did I believe in God. However, I experienced an NDE, and it has changed me completely. And we can focus in on the change aspect, Steve, because you do mention this in your research. So the impact is, after the NDE, I started to concern about the suffering in the world. I comfort others who is in despair. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, he wrote this in his natural language, so this is a translation of Chinese into English. That's why it's a little bit broken. I filled my life with love, and I love to help others. I don't care about money or fame anymore. This is a complete 180 for this for Chen in a materialistic culture, in a materialistic belief system, that what you can achieve on this plane, the materialism that you achieve in the physical existence, is the highest priority. He has this experience and has a complete 180 change in his life. And we'll notice that that's a pattern as we move forward. All right, Victor from Russia, his background, no religious background, formerly plagued with depression, particularly about difficulties completing college. Quote, I simply didn't see the point of my own existence, end quote. NDE, quote, the light was extraordinary. In it were love and peace. I was completely enveloped by love, and I felt totally secure, end quote. The impact, so this would be how he reflected on it and then what it did to him after. So, quote, some invisible force had opened up new paths along which I must travel, something to strive for, that my life was not in vain, and that I should have goals that fill the needs of those around me as well as my own, and that every day should be filled with good and meaningful activities. Weird. It's almost like he should love others as he loves himself. All right. So Hazeline from Singapore.
Heard that from somewhere before.
Yeah, weird. I feel like somebody really important said that at one time. Hazeline from Singapore. Someone spoken to me for a while. I heard, and that voice came from the light. You know what I felt when I saw that light? When I saw that bright light, I felt that someone loves me very much, but no idea who it was. I was very overwhelmed with that bright light, and while I was there, I felt the love, and that love I never felt before. That light welcoming me very warmly and loves me very much. My words to the light before I woke up was this: I wanted to stay here, but I love my two kids. Reason why I felt very overwhelmed. I felt that only that light ever loved me, and no one does. All people knows All people know is only to beat me, hurt me, criticize me, offend me, and many more. Nobody loved me like that kind of love before. Impact. As a single mother parent, I have to love my children unconditionally. My mission is to raise them up in a proper manner and help poor people. Again, interesting.
Unconditional love.
Yeah.
Where do we hear that from?
Well, and I wanna point out something here, right? And we can end with that one. But there's several more. Suresh from India, Gildan from Turkey, Muhammad from Egypt. I mean, we can go on and on. And these are just the ones that Steve noted in his book. We could, of course, pull more from NDERF, Near-Death Experience Research Foundation website, because there's more and more being reported every single day. I was actually reading one just the other day from India. So she notes, Steve, you point out the pattern of love, right? That this is a consistent and common point of the pattern that is mentioned by all these heavenly experiences. Love, 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 love. Hazeline from Singapore really points out what I want to camp on for a moment, which is nobody loved me like that kind of love before. So love is required to have a recipient and a sender. And those are two personal beings. So what I want to ask the audience to think about is think about all the worldviews out there. Okay. We don't need to cap them into religion. Let's just open this up to worldviews, period. Views of reality, if you want to get even more particular. What view of reality posits a supreme, powerful, ultimate being at the center of all of reality, that love is a defining characteristic of that being, and it motivated that being to then send a mission back with these people to where they need to be extremely loving to others as they love themselves. So therefore, they need to love themselves, and they need to love others just as much as they love themselves. I'd like to ask you, what framework does that fit very, very neatly into? And that's why I believe near-death experiences can be considered as valid evidence for the Christian worldview, is because we can kind of focus in on this pattern, and yes, eventually we're going to get to the scripture and theology that can kind of interact with these, and there are definitely some obstacles there that Steve and I will go over, but I do want to point out this pattern of love, how it constantly comes back, and pattern is something that must be experienced by a personal being. God would need to be personal in order to love someone, because it's a choice. Love is a choice, naturally. It's like asking the question, well, can a robot love you when it's ordered to? Well, obviously not. That's not love. That's a servant-like loyalty. It's not actually love, because love requires the choice to love or to not love. So
the agape love of Christianity is just like Hazeline from Singapore said. She said, hey, my mission is to love my children unconditionally. Well, not every worldview teaches that.
No.
I mean, you can look at Marxism. It's all about, let's get a better economy. No matter how many people need to be wiped out in order to do it, according to the way it was lived out by certain leaders in the past, we're working toward a better society. There's nothing about loving the individuals being top priority.
Yeah.
Surveys have been done globally, I shouldn't say globally, but in various cultures, to ask, what is the most important thing in life? And love comes up as a very important thing, but it's typically not like over 50% of the people saying love is the main thing. People think you want to get ahead in your business, you want to be successful, you want to have certain things in life. People have our priorities are all over the board according to the individuals. Here in America, even among Christians, there are a lot of just different priorities that people have. But why is it that consistently, over and over and over in near-death experiences, they come back, pastors will come back and say, one pastor had a near-death experience, and he came back and he said, okay, I was doing all this great work out there in my ministry, but I realized to my horror, I didn't even know the names of my kids' friends. In other words, he wasn't loving his closest neighbors enough to really he'd gotten involved in stuff out there. It's easy for all of us as Christians to do. We get obsessed with ministry, that becomes the big thing. And why is it that these experiences consistently, they come back and say, you know what the main thing is? It's love. and it's an unconditional agape love, just like the Bible talked about. And not all worldviews preach this. Not all worldviews teach that you ought to love your enemy, love everyone, love people selflessly. So I think it's a very good fit with what we've seen in Christianity repeated over and over. What's the most important thing? Love God, love people. Jesus was asked, what's the most important commandment? Here it is.
So,
If you miss love, you've missed everything.
so Steve, I want to actually ask you, as devil's advocate here, let's try to critically break that down. If can you see any other worldview being able to lay a claim to that? You think, Judaism could potentially go in that direction, or, is there any other, Buddhism? Do you think any other worldviews can account for this pattern, can account for this priority?
Well, number one, I'm not familiar with all the worldviews. I'm just familiar with basic ones.
Well, yeah, let's go with the
Some of the
popular
main
ones.
ones, but also I don't want to pigeonhole any person and say, but because there are great varieties of beliefs that go under the banner of Christianity, and also Buddhism and um, Hinduism. They're just, I mean, there's so many different types of Hinduism that you could basically call it the religions of India. But I would say when I'm thinking about it, I don't see any that I'm aware of that have such a strong emphasis on the main thing is love.
Mm-hmm.
Like you look at the original Buddha and his story. He left his wife and young child in order to go seek truth and to seek this experience of nirvana. And in the end, he thinks that was the best thing for his family, because they would learn from their suffering and whatever. But meditation and seeking this nirvana experience was really the main thing. Now, that's not to say that Buddhists aren't loving. I think love is taught in Buddhism. It is. But it's just interesting if meditation was the big thing that God wanted of us, why haven't I seen anybody come back from a near death experience and say, what I need to do more is meditate more. That's what they told me on the other side. And then you look at the Quran and the Hadiths. Go to a topical Quran and search for love. What you'll see is a lot of verses some talking about that you ought to respect and be faithful to fellow Muslims. That's very important. But you'll see a lot of verses on who God does not love. He does not love the person who does not believe that Muhammad was the prophet.
The prophet. Yeah.
God does not love those who act in a certain way. It does not love. It's just, and again, there are plenty of Muslims, especially the ones that are my students, very loving people. I think they're taught in their local groups to love, that's important. I don't want to say it's not. I'm just saying it's not as central as it is in Christianity to say, if you miss this, you've missed the whole thing. And it's not just that you love your friends and family, but you love the world. God so loved the world, and anybody can love people that love them, but you're supposed to love your enemies and everyone. And that's kind of what I see coming out of the near-death experiences. It's love.
Mm. Yeah, and I wanted to point out too that, I think one of the important factors here is you have to evaluate which of these worldviews is actually beginning with a central figure, i.e. God, at the worldview. I mean, a lot of Buddhism would not say that is a core component, that there is this personal God sitting at the center of the universe in control of things, and that love would be a core component of that. So I think that before you can even get started with some of these worldviews, you have to ask, do they even account for this type of being that seems to be the central figure, central character of many of these NDEs? Yes, you have the supporting cast of deceased family members coming and talking to them, but then again, you have this light, this figure where love emanates from this figure, and it's a love like no other love. Again, this light, the love that comes from this light, the personal feeling of compassion that this light has for people, you have to ask yourself, what is that, right? Well, what worldview can account for this being this entity that is clearly a personal being, because again, love is, as we've experienced it, as we know it in all senses of the word, love has a sender, has a receiver. It has a sender, it has a receiver. It has two personal beings involved in it. And so therefore, any worldview that doesn't account for a supreme personal loving being, as according to the near-death experience evidence, would seem to fall incredibly short in its explanatory power. Does that make sense, Steve, the way I just explained that?
I agree with that. And I would just say that a lot of the Western forms of Buddhism kind of take God out of the picture. And so it certainly wouldn't be, near-death experiences would certainly not be consistent with an atheistic form of Buddhism. A lot of Buddhists do believe in an ultimate God that they serve and they love, and I don't want to put all of them in the same category.
Well, I'm talking about we're not critiquing the individual. We're critiquing the ideology. We're critiquing the worldview.
Right.
So it doesn't really have anything to do with the modifications that have happened to Christianity, that have happened to Buddhism, that have happened to Islam. I'm not really concerned with denominations. I'm more so concerned with orthodoxy, right? Of what are the orthodoxy beliefs of that position? And I can tell you that orthodoxy Islam, I do not believe would affirm a loving God. Nor do I believe that to be true of Hinduism or Buddhism.
Yeah, I would just say a lot of Muslims, a lot of people who have certain beliefs in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's just not as close a fit to what we're seeing in near-death experiences as I see Christianity.
Yeah, and it's also a cumulative case argument, right? Like I'm not going to go to a near-death experience research website, read a bunch of near-death experiences, and walk away and say Christianity is true, because that's what that approach will ultimately leave you being like, well, all these religions can be true because God is just love, right? So it's like that's not in and of itself a good way to do this. The way that Steve and I approach this, ladies and gentlemen, is we look at it from the cumulative case of what worldview would even permit these type of experiences to happen, and then the way these experiences are being described, does it fit with any other worldview? Because the world isn't just one line of evidence; it's many lines of evidence. You have your cosmological explanations, the fine-tuning arguments, the historical argument. Was Jesus a real person? Did he die on the cross? I mean, that all needs to be considered into the conversation when you're evaluating near-death experiences. Are they valid? Why are they valid? What can be reliable about them? So I want to make that clear that Steve and I's heart, when we look at near-death experiences, we think they are incredibly fascinating and important as a line of evidence. They are not the sole evidence. They're not to be considered in a vacuum. Just like any other argument, they all need to be considered in cumulative effect. And if one theory has a problem with another theory, again, you have to look at the central point of the worldview. Like materialism, naturalism does a great job of accounting for things like gravity, right? Like when you're trying to explain a scientific principle or scientific law, naturalistic laws, naturalism can do a great job of explaining that, right? Like why does the earth rotate around the sun and not the other way around, right? It does a great job of explaining that. But when it comes to naturalism trying to explain, for example, why it's wrong forever and always to murder someone, well, naturalism's going to have a really hard time with that, right? And so that's what I'm saying is just come to it with the cumulative case. And then when we look at near-death experiences and how they fit into the cumulative case of all of these arguments, Christianity, to me, seems to have this wide open arm that says, come on in, you fit right in with the rest of them, versus these other worldviews are really having to try hard to kind of work around their orthodoxy to fit it into it, or it doesn't fit at all. In the case of naturalism,
and again, we've got a lot to discuss along this line, because some are going to say, no, I don't think that near-death experiences fit that well with Christianity. We need to go in with the biblical evidence, think that thing through. And then somebody who's a type of Muslim who believes that all non-Muslims should have terrible experiences as death, they may just look at these experiences and say, oh, well, I just think those are lies of the enemy. So we got a lot of things we need to cover deception. And think about. One other thing that you mentioned that you wanted to mention regarding the various cultural potential differences in near-death experiences, you said like the works of Shushan and the works of Carol Zaleski, for example. She wrote this book, otherworld journeys, accounts of near-death experiences in medieval and modern times, some people will say, hey, well, wait a minute, in their accounts, they seem to talk about other cultures, like indigenous cultures around the world, and far back cultures, ancient cultures, and then medieval cultures. Some of these seem a little bit different than what we're talking about. I would just say when you're considering those, remember, we're not really comparing apples to apples, because in these indigenous cultures, typically there was not a cardiologist collecting
Mm.
experiences from his patients like a Sabom in the
Yeah.
United States. Typically, we're getting reports from past generations. Somebody heard it from somebody, especially in Zaleski's case. Even though the subtitle says near-death experiences, I'm not going to blame her for this. I think she's a great researcher. It's a good book. But the titles chosen by publishers are often trying to draw in an audience. If you look at the very first of this book, she's not just dealing with near-death experiences. She starts dealing with people who take these religious ventures into caves to try to have some kind of experience. All kinds of visions and things are included. And also, a lot of these were handed down. And you got to ask, in medieval culture, if some experiences were handed down from generation to generation and repeated by pastors, which ones are they going to be? Often, it will be ones that replicate or make a certain niche Roman Catholic doctrine more secure, like purgatory. But you're not getting, and these may be niche anomalous, or who's even checked out the person to see whether they were sane coming down to us. So, and we know that some of these changed over time when we looked at them in their history. So, really, that we're not comparing apples to apples to me when we look at some of these experiences reported by Shushan and by Zaleski. So, to me, that's not really a problem.
Yeah, because like you're mentioning, they're stories that are passed down from generation to generation. It's not like a objective, medically trained professional is actually taking these accounts down themselves.
Now, they're interesting and they are wonderful researchers, both of them. And so I think we have a lot of good outcomes we can come up with. But to me, it doesn't cause a problem with the pattern that we've seen in today's world cross cultures.
Yeah, it does bring up the question. You know, we had somebody, Chris the Observer, comment, use the Shushan model for NDEs. Are you familiar with the Shushan model, Steve, or no?
I'm not sure what they're calling the Shushan
Okay.
model. I've read both of his books on
Yeah, I'd have
his
to look
two
into that.
books on both of that I've just mentioned.
Does he present any kind of model for explaining NDEs or?
From what I've read, he will tend to say that there is this cultural influence, and which again, I come back and say, like you look at Native Americans and they may
Yeah,
go over and see a happy hunting ground.
yeah,
Well, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, well, yeah,
yeah,
if
that
I'm
makes sense for
God
them.
showing them the afterlife, they're going
Yeah.
to go to a place where they see animals, great beauty all around. That's the culture they live in. I don't see that as a contradiction to the pattern, where Shushan may see some more contradiction to where he would say, I don't know. I just think they're really being influenced by culture. I would say I
So,
don't think we're really doing apples to apples in that case, and a little nuance needs to be brought out.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would make complete sense to me because someone who might say like in ancient Israel go to heaven, and they see a modern day New York architecture and clothes of modern day culture there, that's going to seem incredibly foreign to them. Just like if you did the same with a modern New Yorker into ancient Israel and they saw that in heaven. So to me, it makes sense that if you know God can conform reality in such a way that it's what we would feel comfortable with, then of course people are going to go to the other side and see and interpret the things that are most comfortable to them. And you mentioned this in your research, Steve, that I love this theory because I had never really thought about this. I think you write this in your most recent book that's yet to come out, where you would talk about people seeing different quadrants or sections of heaven. So it's what's to say that heaven's not this massive place and there's a giant hunting ground, and then there's like just these snapshots of culture that if you had an actual chance to stay there, you could venture across them and see all these different people in times and places and be able to interact with believers across all these time frames, or people that God found worthy to enter heaven. So I don't think it at all does anything to debunk the NDE experience itself, to just simply say, I think it does 100% make sense to say, okay, people are having these cultural influences help them understand, oh yeah, I met the Great Spirit, right? We might call that God, but a Native American in their worldview would say, well, the best way I can understand that is to just say that was the Great Spirit. They'd never heard of Jesus. They'd never heard of, Yahweh or any of this Israel religion. But nonetheless, as even in the Christian worldview, God has built a system for all the appropriate people to wind up in heaven. So that's what I would say about it. It's Christians might be like, well, they're not Christians, so how are they going to heaven? It's like, well, there was a great time period where a lot of people weren't Christians, and they're still going to be in heaven. So I don't.
And let me praise Shushan a little bit. He's a great researcher, and he's done a huge service to humanity by, to me, debunking something of the kind of new atheist agenda, which says, okay, back in the past, people just kind of came up with these ideas of heaven because they weren't really scientific, and so they see the leaves moving and they don't understand air and wind, and so they say, oh, it's the spirits or whatever. So they develop their theories of religion on all these pre-scientific things. Shushan shows in many, many cases, both in ancient civilizations and in indigenous cultures, that actually people were having experiences, visions or near-death experiences, and deathbed experiences, and that you ask this Native American tribe, why do you believe in the afterlife? And they don't say something pre-scientific. They'll say, oh, well, my father had this experience where he went to the other side and he saw our relatives, deceased relatives, alive on the other side. That's why we're believing in the afterlife. And so I think this is kind of a general revelation that God gave to many, many cultures, maybe every culture through history, that says, hey, there is a God, there is an afterlife.
Yeah.
Just like we look at the creation and say, there's something powerful and very smart out there. It's a general revelation that tells us something about God and gives seekers something to delve into and reflect upon.
Yeah, it's like a breadcrumb trail, right? That God intends for us to follow, and to seek Him out.
I believe it's true. Yes.
Yeah. So that's exactly how I see it too. It's just that God's dropping these breadcrumbs to people at different times, different places, and and in those cultures, people had every reason to believe. If your great grandfather had a vision, and for a small village that's living on the plains of pre-American time frame, of course that would be incredibly valuable evidence to a people like that when you have someone who has a special revelation, or not necessarily a special revelation, but a special experience like that, to come out and say, yeah, I saw our people over there, I met the Great Spirit. Like, that would have a lot of validity in their mind, and they would have no reason not to believe this person, especially when it comports with what maybe they had already received from a different experience, and it lines up with, yeah, that person also met the Great Spirit, and also, so it wouldn't shock me at all that would be the trend we could expect to find.
Right, and we see that in Shushan, and he's done us a huge service by getting into the details of these reports from the most ancient cultures and indigenous cultures. Great research.
The question again should be, at any point, why are people dying or having near death, right? Clinical death, as you like to say, which I like that as the kind of term. Why are these people, when they have these clinical deaths, going and experiencing this all to begin with? Why is there such structure? Why is there such pattern? Again, those have to be the pressing questions in people's mind, not just simply trying to say, well, that was just their culture, right? Well, this ancient Viking died and he met Odin. And it's like, well, if you understand Norse mythology, you could say that Odin's the highest possible figure. Be like, well, did you meet Thor and the other guys? But like, no, they weren't present, but I did meet Odin, right? So it's like, well, you could safely say, by looking at the pattern, well, that was the highest central figure of their godhead, and so therefore we could easily posit and say, well, they met God, right?
Right.
So but then other people would be like, well, they met Odin, and it was Odin. It's like, well, that's the best explanation they had for who the highest powerful being was in their culture, and they just intuitively understood that from these experiences, that the person that they were meeting was the head, quote, honcho of the whole shebang.
Let me bring up one thing that we mentioned last week, which was with all these naturalistic theories, there's several observations that apply to all of them. They don't seem to explain very well. And one of them is with Sabone's study, he found people must have been actually coming out of their bodies during a time of clinical death because they could describe the resuscitation so accurately.
Mm.
Well, if these things are just caused by random hallucinations or vivid dreams pulling from our memories because of our culture and our influences, then how are they seeing their bodies? How are they seeing their resuscitations? That just doesn't fit well with the evidence we have. Why is it, if that's the case, if it's just caused by culture and whatever, why is it that all of the great summaries we have with the people that have studied near-death experiences their whole life, why do they all say this is not cannot be explained just by cultural differences and all
Yeah.
these things? These are the things we can apply to all these naturalistic theories. Then we need to come back to just, they do not explain the seemingly supernatural elements of near-death experiences.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, this was a awesome episode. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up today. So do us a favor, guys. If you enjoyed today's content, give us a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and most of all, comment below. Like, comment with your questions, comment with your interactions. Steve and I are very much have a heart for trying to create a community around this, and to just engage with these questions and to delve in. Like you said, I think it was last week and the episode before. I mean, we're truth seekers at the end of the day. Both Steve and I want to align ourselves with what is true. And we just find that Christianity properly represents that. And Jesus even says, those who love truth will love me. And so that's how we describe ourselves, lovers of truth. And we seek it out and we find that, there's a lot of truth to be had in these experiences. And this podcast is dedicated to walking through those and finding the truth and how it can really help inform us on what worldviews we should pay attention to and which ones we could, frankly, give a little less credit to, I should say. So, but thank you guys so much for coming in for this episode. We look forward to seeing you guys back next week. Just a heads up that next week's episode, we're going to film a little bit ahead of time, and then it won't be live. Next week's episode won't be live. Dr. Miller will be celebrating Mother's Day, as will I, with our respective families. So you guys are going to get a little bit of a pre-recorded episode, but it will be the next episode in Afterlife Apologetics. So we'll look forward to seeing you guys then. Anything?
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, you bet, Steve. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you in the next one. Talk to you later. God bless. And